Hi, I'm Hobie1. This is Red Chair Reading. I'm reading the Black Book of Secrets, Chapter 17. Let's go. Horatio Cleaver. He's a murderer, hissed the oldest Sourdough. He takes his chopper in the middle of the night and goes hunting for fresh meat, man meat. And he puts it in his pies, added the middle brother, while the third, the youngest, began to whimper. The three boys stood outside the butcher's window watching as he sharpened his knives. They loved the scrape of the blade on the metal and to see the sparks that flew about his head. "If you know this," asked the youngest tremulously, "how come he's not in jail with all the other murderers?" His brothers poured scorn on this ridiculous suggestion. "There's no proof, stupid. You can't put a man in prison without proof. And the proof is in the pies," said the other. "By the time the murder is discovered, it's too late." "Yeah, 'cause they've been eaten," shrieked the pair in unison. Shrieked. As for Horatio Cleaver, the subject of this slander, as soon as he saw their wet noses against the window, he roared at them and ran to the door and shook his knives violently in their direction. "Get your filthy noses off my panes," he shouted. The trio ran away, screaming and laughing, tripping and skidding down the icy hill, with their arms flailing. Ludlow and Joe arrived just in time to see the Sourdough boys disappearing in the distance. Horatio was still standing by the door of his shop, his fists clenched. When he noticed them, they were a strange sight. Joe stood out from the crowd, and not only on account of his unusual height, he strode with a confidence despite his limp, and was both disarming and enviable. Even people who had lived in the village all their lives could not negotiate the steep, icy slope with such ease. Ludlow was always a few steps behind, no higher than Joe's elbow, trotting to keep up. Horatio quickly slipped back inside behind the counter. Joe stood for a moment, some moments actually, looking in the window, eyeing the butcher's wares. Today, he had for sale a selection of crock pies, a braise of pheasants, best lamb cloutets, and whole puckled chickens. Horatio had not even seen the inside of a schoolhouse. "I won't be long," said Joe, and he went in, leaving Ludlow outside, where he stood and watched. As a butcher, Horatio Cleaver was far from the best, but he was the only one the village had, so people made do. His father, Stanton Cleaver, had been renowned near and far for his meat-carving skills, and was remembered fondly by all his customers. He could butcher a whole cow, head to tail, in under 3 minutes, a feat he performed annually to wild applause at the county fair. Who could forget the sight of Stanton holding up the butcher's cup to deafening cheers, his white apron sodden with blood and his hands stained pink? Horatio certainly couldn't, and unfortunately, he was never likely to take his father's place on that stand. He was reminded of this fact every day when he heard the disappointed sighs of his customers and the tut-tuts as he hacked at their joints and their chops, but they always took the rather roughly hewn cuts of meat he handed them. For if they got more than they asked for, they certainly paid less than it was worth. Horatio had never been good with numbers, and the complex relationship between weight and price was one he hadn't managed to grasp. And if it wasn't the customers sending him scornful looks, it was Stanton himself. For painted on the wall behind the counter was a life-size portrait of the man, complete with a boning knife in his hand and a sneer on his face. Horatio could feel his eyes boring into the back of his head, and he grew nervous and stammered. A legacy of his time serving his father, It was only on his P's, however, and most noticeable when he was nervous or his temper was roused. Stanton was not an easy man to forget, despite the fact that he had been in the grave nearly 5 years. He had a long reach. Late at night, Horatio would wake, gasping for breath, as if the master's butcher's hands were around his neck, suffocating him. Horatio had not had a happy apprenticeship, and his father had often been driven to violence by his son's poor butchering skills. Horatio had started in the shop as soon as he could reach the counter, and over the years the young butcher had begun to take on the appearance of the meat with which he worked all day. He had gradually become more solid in the body, rather like a bull, and his thick, hairless forearms were shaped like 2 shanks of lamb. His skin was the color of hung meat, a sort of creamy blue, and of similar texture. His face was long, and his nostrils flared, and his brown eyes surveyed his surroundings with mild interest. The tips of his fingers were thick and blunted. For a man who made his living working with knives, he was surprisingly careless. Horatio wiped his bloodied palms on his graying, striped apron and meted Joe with a pleasant "good afternoon" and a nervous smile. He nodded in the direction of the fleeing children. "I should make sausages out of them," he joked, the blades of his knives glittering in the lamplight. Outside, Ludlow shuddered at the sight. Joe laughed politely. "Let me introduce myself," he said. "I am Joe Zabbidou." "The pawnbroker," interrupted Horatio. Joe responded with a small bow. "You're up in the old milliner's shop. I hope you do better than Betty Peggotty." Joe raised his left eyebrow quizzically. "She made hats," continued Horatio, blowing on his huge red hands. The temperature in the shop was only marginally higher than outside. "Very expensive, mind. Peacock plumes, ostrich feathers, silk flowers, and all that sort of thing. Not to my taste. Too fancy. Me, I like plain hat." He touched his white butcher's cap proudly and left specks of gristle on the brim. "Ew, so I see." She couldn't make any money, so she went to the city to run an alehouse, I believe. He secured a piece of pork to the counter and, with the heel of his hand, hacked at it absent-mindedly with a knife. "Wrong location, see? Too far up that cursed hill. No one goes up that end these days unless they're laid out in a box. Even then they have to be pulled up. It would wake the dead." Oops. Pull it. Take 6 horses, and the noise of that coffin on the cobbles would wake the dead. He stopped, knife in midair, to laugh at his own joke. "They come up to me," said Joe. "So I've heard." "Well, maybe you'll have more luck than she did. Jeremiah Ratchet thinks not." Between you and me, Jeremiah Ratchet is a poo-poo. Horatio spat with contempt into the sawdust. "Patooey!" Didn't take him long to stick his oar in. He said he was a businessman. "Pa!" exclaimed Horatio. "That slimy toad. I'll wager he's made a deal or two with the devil in his time. He lives off the backs of the poor, lending money, then taking all they have when they can't pay it back, throwing them out of their homes for the sake of a few days' rent. He'll bleed this village dry. No wonder he got on so well with my father. They were cut from the same cloth." He brought down his knife with a tremendous crash, sending a huge pork chop spiraling into the air and over the counter. Joe caught it with lightning speed. He looked straight into the butcher's sad eyes. And though Horatio wanted to look away, for some reason, he couldn't. His ears filled with a soft noise, like wind through trees, and he felt his legs go weak. His deadened fingertips seemed to have developed pins and needles. "You sound like a man who needs to get something off his chest," said Joe quietly. "Come up to the shop tonight. Maybe I can help." "I doubt it," replied Horatio slowly, mesmerized by Joe's gaze. Joe was insistent. "After midnight, so no one knows." "Perhaps." "Excellent," said Joe, smiling broadly and breaking the spell. "Until then, what about my pork chop?" "I'll have it for my supper," said Joe. "I'll pay you later, when you come up." Oh, if this is interesting to you, please be sure to boop the like button. You'll help the video spread to other people. You'll be helping me out too. I thank you for that. And yeah, thank you very much. Do it. Please. Okay, the church bell sounded midnight. As Horatio pulled his coat closer and raised his fist to the door, the pale half-moon watched quietly as he dithered, in two minds whether to knock. He hadn't meant to come and didn't really understand why he was here, but as midnight approached, his restless feet had taken him out of the door and up the hill. How could this stranger help him? In fact, how did this stranger even know he needed help? He remembered how Joe had looked at him. Had he sucked his thoughts out of his head? Horatio raised his fist, but before he could strike the wood, Joe opened the door. Gosh, I haven't seen a knocker in a long time. "Horatio, come in," he said warmly. "We've been expecting you." He led the silent butcher into the back room, where the fire was blazing. Horatio lowered his sturdy frame into the offered chair and frowned as it creaked, alarmingly. Joe handed him a glass of the golden liquid, and he took a long draught, then another. His cheeks flushed, and his eyes shone. "A powerful drop," he said, and drained his glass. "I believe you have a secret you'd like to pawn," prompted Joe. Horatio's eyebrows met in a quizzical frown. What do you mean?" "It is what I do," explained Joe. I buy secrets." Horatio considered the proposal for a short moment. "Then buy this," he said. Ludlow was already settled at the table, the black book opened before him. And Horatio began. Oh, well, that's the end of chapter 17. That's a pretty good one. Thank you for joining me. I'll catch you next time in chapter 18. Bye.